Hot takes with the good robot. Hot takes with the good robot.
Welcome to the second episode of the Good Robot Hot Takes. Every 2 weeks, Kerry and I will be giving our hot take on some of the biggest issues in tech today. This week, we talk about science fiction films, why we love Alien and Sigourney Weaver, and how female AI scientists and professionals are represented by Hollywood on screen. We also think about how film contributes to inequality in the AI industry, why Tony Stark sucks, and why he and Nathan Bateman aren't just bad apples, but part of an epidemic of bad and conceited AI scientists that we see today on screen. We hope you enjoy the show.
Hi, and welcome back to our second ever Good Robot Hot Take, where Eleanor and I bring you our spicy opinions about whatever happens to be on our minds. And so this week, we're talking about films about AI, and specifically Hollywood films. So, Eleanor, when is the last time you watched a film about AI?
I'm so excited for the spicy takes. This is a good question. We're watching them at the moment for a paper that we're going to talk about. But I'd probably rather say, why did I even start enjoying science fiction films in the first place? And I was thinking about this earlier today, and I remember the planetarium, this amazing place on Baker Street where you go when you're little or as a school trip, and you sit in this dome-like building and you look up at this massive screen with stars, and it explains about the solar system and how it works. And I found it truly magical. And that's what I'm looking for in a science fiction film. It's really the technology that is exciting, that is a different way of consuming a film. You're enthralled not just by the storyline, but by CGI, by whatever is the most innovative technology that is supporting this kind of film today. So I know that I am fundamentally a theorist of gender, but I usually put that hat to one side when I go to the films, and I want a total suspension of disbelief and just to go all in for something. So the last thing that I watched was Aliens, and I love Sigourney Weaver. I'm just such a massive fan. I love that she stares out the alien. You have that like woman on woman moment when they're just looking at each other like, yeah, we're both really powerful, but one of us has to die. It's like Harry Potter and Voldemort, but the original version and much better.
Yeah, so next week's hot take is actually just Eleanor and I looking at each other and deciding which one of us has to die. Yeah, so I watched Aliens for the first time a week or two ago again for our research. It was so good. I've never seen any of the Alien series, and I was like I'm not a big film watcher as a person, but this I was like, it was too scary for me because I'm also a wimp. But genuinely, I was like, this is such a good film.
Yeah, there's something great about the chest bursters that come out of the men as well. And I used to describe it as inverse rape. And I still maintain that it's fundamentally a film about colonization. It's the humans that want to go and take over that planet. They want to make it habitable. They send over families to terraform it. And you're positioned to make you feel bad for the human families, right? Because they bang on about the children that are there. You have this little girl. But really, the aliens were doing fine. Like, okay, they're gross, but we could have just left them alone and let them do their own thing. So you have that tension, like, who are we supposed to feel bad for? And that's what's amazing, too, about Octavia Butler and her Genesis series. You have these really grotesque descriptions of alien-human intercourse where the aliens don't let humans copulate with each other without alien intervention. But really, at the end of the day, the aliens kept the humans alive. So I want a science fiction film where you don't really know who to vouch for. And part of you is a bit like, maybe I am an alien. What was the last film you saw?
Oh, well, unfortunately, the last film that I saw that had AI in it was The Amazing Spider-Man 2, which was not a rip-roaring ride. It was a very, very long film with people who clearly looked like in their 30s playing 18-year-olds, which just the older I get, the more and more I'm like, I cannot suspend my disbelief enough to believe that these people. It's easier for me to believe that Andrew Garfield is Spider-Man than it is for me to believe that he's an 18-year-old. It was fine. It was just like a very classic, like, AI female service assistant, the kind of trope that we see time and time again and stuff like Spike Jonze is her and, you know, the Iron Man series with Friday. So yeah, I think it was not particularly riveting. And again, I mentioned I'm not a big film watcher, but at the same time, I think it's really important we talk about films because they have an incredible power when it comes to shaping our cultural understanding of what AI is, and also in quite directly driving and interacting with forms of tech development. I know that's something you're really interested in, Eleanor, this kind of feedback loop between Silicon Valley and the kinds of films that are made in Hollywood.
And also, on the Andrew Garfield note, I think what's really annoying is that the narrative of this film is that men can't do what they're supposed to do, like the chores, the duties, the obligations to their relationship, to the people closest to them. Like, he can't turn up to Emma Stone's graduation because he's too busy saving the world, you know? And it's like, okay, most men aren't saving the world, but it's just a justification of not fulfilling their obligations. That's an aside. Yeah, so the feedback loop I think is really interesting. I found all these things online about Elon Musk's favorite books, and the top 10 favorite books are all kind of the same. They're all Asimov, the same kinds of writers of science fiction. I think they're all male, could be wrong. But there's loads of science fiction out there, and it's really sad that he is reading a similar genre of book from a similar period. And there's loads of different kinds of works from across the globe from different kinds of writers that remains unread. The problem with that is that those films don't get transformed into products. So Josh Wolf, who's another investor in AI, also reads similar books to Musk. He reads a lot of Asimov, and then he invests in a lot of companies that have names from Asimov's works that bring to life kinds of robotics and kinds of innovations under the same kinds of principles, those 3 laws of robotics. And this means that the things that we have in our daily life, the technologies that we use, all come from the same kind of imagination, this quite masculinist mode of imagining what is possible.
Absolutely. And I think the interplay between fact and fiction here is just extremely weird. And it's something that people will often say, oh, well, why study science fiction? You know, these are just stories. But they have a real tangible impact, as you've said, on what kinds of projects get funded and also what kinds of frameworks people have for thinking about technology, all the way through to like who gets involved in these different kinds of AI ethics projects. One of my favorite kind of weird overlap facts is that Morgan Freeman, who plays a character in the very bad 2014 AI film Transcendence, is now on like the board of advisors or something of the Future of Life Institute, which thinks a lot about AI risk, which is something we talked about in our last hot takes on these big open letters about pausing AI. So definitely check out that episode. But isn't that just so bizarre that a Hollywood actor, who I assume is definitely not also an AI ethicist on the side, I don't think Morgan Freeman needs to be doing, now sits on an advisory board? Robert Downey Jr. deliberately based Iron Man's character on Elon Musk, right? And there was this very deliberate interplay between the two of them to the extent that Elon Musk then appears in Iron Man 2 as a kind of some kind of background actor. I can't remember the exact role, but it's really interesting to think about this character who's very much portrayed as a hero and like the beating heart of the Marvel Cinematic Universe, very, very culturally influential, possibly almost entirely responsible for reinvigorating the career of Robert Downey Jr., was based on a figure who we would possibly say has had some very public falls from grace recently, but maybe is an AI figure or tech figure that we don't necessarily want our quote unquote heroes emulating.
Tony Stark is this classic genius, solitary figure that works alone. He's not very nice. He's kind of a dick, but self-obsessed. And we don't want to encourage people to think that they have to be like that in order to be a genius or an innovator. You can be nice and work in a team. So maybe that leads us well onto our own findings from our research paper on this interaction between film and reality. So Kerry, describe it to us. What did we do? What did we find?
Absolutely. So the theme of today's episode is, as you can tell from our title, most films about AI are boring. And I just want to clarify, the research study we've done was not, are films about AI boring? Obviously, that would be a very subjective study. But what we did instead is we decided to try and look at how AI scientists are represented on screen in these very popular or big budget or influential films. And if you're really deeply interested in the methods and how we decided which films fit in that corpus, you can go read our paper. It's all available in Public Understanding of Science, and we'll have the article linked in the show notes. We know that the AI industry is a place that has been very, very inhospitable to certain people, that white men are way overrepresented, women and people of color are grossly underrepresented. And we think one driving factor behind this is what we call the cultural construction of the AI engineer in this paper, which was co-authored with Dr. Stephen Cave and Dr. Kant Dihal. And so we thought, okay, has anyone actually comprehensively mapped how AI scientists are portrayed on screen, and particularly how their representations correspond with gender? And I think we already had quite negative opinions in mind about what we thought we'd find, but we really were quite blown away to find that of 142 films that featured AI, of which 86 showed an AI researcher or more than one AI researcher, we found that only 9 out of these 116 scientists were women. So that's 8%. And also that none of these films were solely directed by a woman. So you see this kind of environment being portrayed on screen, which is heavily exclusive, to the extent that women scientists were even more poorly reflected on screen than they are in life, because the number of women in AI is very low, but I think globally, about 22% of AI professionals are women. So there was a stark gap between what the reality of the industry is and what people are seeing on screen.
So it's not just that cinema mirrors reality, but is actually substantially worse, which tells us that, as you were saying, in the popular imagination, there's something about AI, what it stands for, what it looks like, what it conjures within us, that makes us feel that men should be doing it.
Exactly. And also important to note that AI and computer science did significantly worse in other kinds of STEM, so science, technology, engineering, mathematics figures, right? So again, female scientists are just very badly represented in general, but there was a really big gap here, even further than that when it came to computer sciences.
And it hasn't always been this way, right? That's what Ma Hicks was saying when we talked to them a couple of weeks ago. Do you want to just tell everyone?
Yeah, of course. Ma Hicks is an amazing historian of technology, and we have a podcast episode with them, which we're very thrilled about. Ma Hicks has traced, in a book called Programmed Inequality, the history of computing in the UK, specifically how computing was originally understood as feminine work, as a secretarial profession that wasn't very well remunerated, wasn't very well respected, and how in the 80s it transformed into this very masculine profession as it became more societally valued, more seen as a technical field, and started to pay a lot more. And Ma Hicks actually argues that this is one of the major reasons why Britain stopped being a world leader in computing, this gender dynamic change. And again, it's also important to note that not only did computing used to be a much more heavily female field, there's also a lot of countries where women are much better represented in computer science. The US and the UK, I think, are just particularly bad examples when it comes to representation.
Yeah, do you remember we talked to some women from Indaba X? So Indaba X helps build capacity in machine learning in Africa. And we were talking about discrimination in STEM subjects in the UK. And the women we were talking to said, well, Indaba X's organizing committee is mostly female. You were like, okay. So really, it's a problem that looks different across the globe.
And that's why I think it's particularly worrying, though, that these very culturally dominant Hollywood films, because we looked also at these like global lists of highest grossing films, that the films that, as Eleanor mentioned earlier, are really culturally prominent, the kinds of sci-fi stories that get told on the big screen are very much coming from the West, and they're very much reproducing these harmful American and British stereotypes about who counts as an AI scientist.
And we got to see firsthand the effect that this has, because Stephen Cave, who's the director for the Center for Future Intelligence, where we work, he was watching these films with his 3 daughters. And when you're showing them Tony Stark-like AI creators, and they're not seeing themselves represented back in these figures, you can see what it means to them. You can see in their reactions, in their projections of their own ideas onto these films and vice versa, that it really does impact young people. And you have these really heavily militarized contexts in films. What's the best example of a really militarized science fiction film with AI?
Oh, I actually do have an interesting example here, but it does come back to the Marvel Cinematic Universe again. This is my main body of knowledge for this paper, it turns out, which is that different films in the MCU actually worked with the Pentagon, right, to be able to use some of the military materials. So there's this like really, really strong interrelationship between Marvel and Disney and the military industrial complex, the US, which is wild because these are some of the most high budget, widely watched films in the world.
Yeah. So when we're thinking about gender, we're not just trying to do a head count of men and women. We're thinking about the masculinization of AI and also the feminization of certain tropes around self-sacrificial women that have to die in order for humanity to be saved, which is what happens in Transcendence, this god-awful film with Johnny Depp that could be its own episode of us just bitching Transcendence. And you have Rebecca Hall, who is a really intelligent seeming person. And it doesn't really make sense on screen for her to be handing Johnny Depp his clothes and introducing him at seminars. You really feel like it should be the other way around. So we're really attentive to what counts as a masculinized and a feminized film rather than just doing what you'd expect gender scholars to do, which is do like a duck, duck, goose with men and women.
Yeah, exactly. So we definitely did the duck, duck, goose. We counted because we were like, look, it's imperfect, but we do think it's important to get some kind of quantifiable sense of how these scientists are being portrayed. But we also looked at a number of different kinds of gender tropes that arose from the film. So one of them, as Eleanor's mentioned, was this idea of the genius. And so that was about a third of our creators were portrayed as intellectually extraordinarily brilliant. And that is a massive problem because, as a number of scholars have pointed out, and I'm going to link their papers again in the show notes, there's an idea called the brilliance bias, which suggests that women tend to be discouraged from entering careers where it's perceived that you need to be a genius or have really unusually high intellect to succeed in it. So this tends to include fields like philosophy or mathematics and, yes, also computer science. And this is not because people tend to think that women as a whole are less intelligent than men, although I'm sure we've all met some people like this, but more that there tends to be this broader stereotype that extraordinary brilliance is more associated with men. And we could maybe attribute this to a very biased historical record where people like Einstein and Newton all tend to be men because women were systemically blocked from education, among other things. And so we think that it really matters that we're portraying AI scientists as these individual geniuses on screen, these child prodigies, people like Tony Stark who can invent an element in one night, like really wild things. And look, I'm not saying that we should have to watch films which very slowly watch someone work in a lab for 40 years. It's more just that this is so unrepresentative of how these products are made, the teamwork that's required, and just the slowness and the frustration of AI development. It really makes it seem like magic. And that is such a harmful myth to be propagating.
Yeah. And even the first research paper that I could find published by OpenAI was co-authored by something like 20 to 30 engineers and other team members. So it's a massively collaborative endeavor. So you can see that what we're trying to do is two things. We're trying to do some counting because people like statistics, but then we also do this more qualitative analysis where we look for examples, tropes, that kind of thing, so we can make our argument in many different ways. We were asked a lot, not just about the creators, but about the bots themselves. How is AI gendered? What does AI look like in a lot of these films? I was talking to a guy at the BBC who was saying how many of these AI humanoids are women and how many are sexualized. And immediately, quite a few popped to mind. Go on, Kerry.
Definitely Ava from Ex Machina. That to me is just one of the epitome of this very white, hypersexualized, hyperfeminine kind of android. I know.
For me, it's Ghost in the Shell, Scarlett Johansson's naked bodysuit. And actually, now is a good segue into thinking about techno-Orientalism. So maybe in relation to Ghost in the Shell, which probably quite a few people have seen, can you explain to us what techno-Orientalism is and how that relates to Scarlett and her nudity?
Yeah, of course. And so something I think about a lot, right, is how in a lot of these science fiction films, they're preoccupied with this question of what does it mean to be human in a technological age? And what happens if we could no longer separate out technology from the machine? But the way that they often communicate this idea is through the use of Asia as a kind of background or Asianness as a coded metaphor for an age where humanity and technology are no longer identifiable or separable from one another. And so Asia comes to represent this dystopian, techno-forward future. And I argue that this reflects a really, really long history of how Asian people have been racialized in the West as being somehow machinic, technological. And this can be linked to this long history of labor extraction under capitalism, where the mechanized body of the coolie, quote unquote, was seen as being this sort of insensate, ever suffering, insensitive to pain body that could labor unendingly under capitalism. And this, I think, is really prominent, these ideas in things like Blade Runner, the whole kind of cyberpunk genre, which emerged in the 1980s in response to the so-called Japan Panic, or the specter of a rising Japan. But we can also see it very much in films like Ex Machina, where we have Kyoko, for example, the Asian gynoid who we don't actually know in the film till halfway through that she's a robot, whereas Ava is shown from the beginning as robotic. Kyoko, we just assume, apparently the audience does, that because she's quiet and she's servile, that she's just playing the role of an Asian woman and the really harmful gendered and racial stereotypes associated with the position. So it comes as a shock then halfway through the film when she takes off part of her face and it's revealed that actually, like Ava, she is also a robot. So one way that Kanter and Stephen put out, co-authors, is that there's multiple kinds of Turing tests going on here, multiple tests of what it means to be human, but they're very much bound up in these gendered and racial norms.
So beautifully put. And for everyone, this is cutting edge theory. Kerry is writing a book about this. She talks a lot on the BBC about it as a new generation thinker. So listen to all her free thinking episodes if you're interested to find out more.
Thanks. Oh, I just realized I never actually talked about Scarlett Johansson, which was like your original thought. Yeah, I mean, firstly, this movie is a mess. It takes all the things that are really interesting about the original Ghost in the Shell and just like Hollywoodifies it and turns it into this like liberal narrative of Scarlett Johansson being empowered. And like that doesn't even begin to deal with all the complexities of politics that surrounded Scarlett Johansson's casting as Major Motoko Kusanagi, or the Major as she got rebranded. It did spawn, though, less academically, so many of my favorite memes of Scarlett Johansson as a member of the Asian community. So if you really love mean memes, I would recommend all of this material.
I have not seen those memes, but I will be tentatively looking at after this. I think you'll probably send me like 15, so I won't even have to.
Definitely. I think the question of Scarlett Johansson is really interesting, though, because I think something that you said to me that I found really striking was how much more likely it is for women to see themselves on screen as a sex bot than as a scientist.
Yeah. Or married to a genius. I think like even in real life, you see, oh my God, my semi-knowledge of supermodels, but not really quite. What's her face that's married to the Snapchat guy?
Oh, is it Miranda Kerr?
Yes. The supermodels are marrying the geniuses. They are the new genre of sportsmen, right?
Mm-mm.
And it's fascinating to watch, but at the same time, they're getting these ideas from these movies where there is the wonderful, beautiful, very intelligent Rebecca Hall married to Johnny Depp. I want to see a film where it's The Bachelorette, but she's an AI scientist.
Yeah, I want to see a film without Johnny Depp. So just in general, not a fan of Johnny Depp. But also, it is interesting that you frame it as this, why do they all end up married to these scientists? Because it's also something that we identified in the films, right? And this is a trope we called womb envy. The idea that a lot of these AI scientists are not only portrayed as men, but they're also portrayed as creating technology in their own image. And there's this like God complex that plays into it. And I think that's so strong in Ex Machina. Like you see Nathan, who's very unambiguously portrayed as the bad guy, but he like talks about them like his children, or he like places them as a part of this kind of evolutionary schema. And the way this is done is like very racial and very awful. But I think it does reveal something about this sort of positioning of the AI genius as supposedly omnipotent and trying to continue on their own like paternal line.
As Anne Cheng, this wonderful literary theorist and philosopher, talks about, race is the toggle by which these sex bots are both inhuman, they are not quite human, they don't deserve to be treated as human by their creator. But at the same time, race is that which signals to us that they're supposed to be human, because the human is always racialized, it's always gendered. So the human can be broken down in its component parts. So when you're building a sex bot, in order for it to appear human, it must have a race, it must have a gender. So then it gets us thinking, what would it mean to have a sex bot that queered race and gender so that it could be a kind of queer inhuman in a certain way, that it wasn't subscribing to gender and racialized norms. And we just need more imagination. We need a different kind of imagination to get us to those spaces.
Absolutely. I think this is a really beautiful place to slowly bring our episode to a close, which is very sad because I really could complain about science fiction films all day. But Eleanor, why do sci-fi films matter when we're thinking about AI and AI ethics? And what would you like to see change going forward? What's your key takeaway from this episode for anyone who skipped the rest of it?
Science fiction films are massively popular. They are the big blockbusters. So whether or not you like them, you have to care about them. I did my PhD on science fiction, not because I was a massive fan, although I really like science fiction when it's good. And I love the science fiction community because they're just like a really nice bunch of people and you get hugs at the end of conferences. But because it's a genre that is widely accessible, it's really pulpy. Lots of people are influenced by the philosophy behind science fiction. So it melds philosophy and literature in a really interesting way. And you get these beautiful genre blurring sometimes also between detective fiction and romance and science fiction, which is what happens in Italy. There's so much amazing science fiction written by queer authors, by women authors from across the world. And these books are not being made into films. No one is spending the millions that it takes to bring these wonderful worlds to life. So I highly recommend that you read Aliette de Boudau's The Universe series if you want to see how ancestor spirits and machine and women and different kinds of power hierarchies come to play in this world where geopolitics has been transformed. So the domination of Anglo-America that we see today hasn't come about in the future, and that makes it really interesting. There's some amazing books by the Spanish writers Nona Robles and Elia Barceló, where these female-looking aliens actually make human men pregnant, and they're these wonderful comedies that could be made into fantastic science fiction comedy films. So I would really urge producers, budding screenwriters, actors to try to bring these amazing ways of thinking about the future to life.
Absolutely. And for our listeners, we would love to hear your thoughts as well. What's your favorite science fiction film? Which science fiction films do you hate? And what kinds of stories would you like to see told? As always, the full transcript of our episode will be on our website, www.thegoodrobot.co.uk, where you'll find not only the full transcript of this episode, but also a reading list of everything that we've mentioned, including those wonderful stories Eleanor has talked about, and anything else we think that you might like to read or listen to. But until then, thanks for listening to this week's Hot Take, and we'll see you again soon.
Hot takes with the